La viuda apache encontró al ganadero moribundo y la susurró, no morirás solo. The wind blew in harsh gusts, carrying dust that scratched against the skin and made the eyes water. In this vast, empty land lived Isabel, a young Apache widow. She was small in stature but strong in spirit, her brown eyes reflecting both the pain of her past and the quiet determination that had kept her alive. The desert was all she had known for most of her life after the loss of her family, and she had learned to survive with whatever the land offered. Her small shelter, made of clay, sticks, and stones, sat at the edge of a quiet village, far enough from prying eyes but close enough that she could trade when necessary. Isabel's life had been shaped by loss. She remembered the nights when she had sat alone by the fire, listening to the echoes of her family's laughter in her mind, wishing she could turn back time. Those memories were painful, yet they had made her resilient. Over the years, she had become deeply self-reliant, skilled in reading the desert, finding water where none seemed to exist, and recognizing the signs of danger before they arrived. She moved with quiet confidence, almost as if she were part of the landscape itself. Each morning she would walk long distances to gather herbs, roots, and small game, always careful to respect the land as her ancestors had taught her. One afternoon, the desert seemed unusually silent. Even the birds that normally sang in the sparse trees were nowhere to be seen. Isabel felt a strange tension in the air, a sense that something was different that day. As she walked along the dry riverbed, searching for herbs and wild plants, her sharp eyes caught a movement in the distance. At first she thought it was just a tumbleweed carried by the wind, but as she drew closer, she saw the outline of a man lying among the rocks, his body twisted unnaturally. He did not move. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. In all her years of solitude, she had never encountered a stranger in such a state, and instinctively she felt both fear and compassion. She approached cautiously, her hands ready to defend herself if necessary. The man's face was caked with dirt and blood, his clothes torn. His breathing was shallow and his eyes fluttered open just enough to meet hers. There was a moment of hesitation, a silent communication between them. Isabel could see the struggle in his eyes, the fight to stay alive, the confusion and the desperation. "Please help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. It was rough and weak, as though even speaking required every ounce of his strength. Isabel didn't respond with words at first. Instead, she studied him, searching for signs of life, trying to understand what had happened. She noticed bruises along his arms and legs, deep scratches from the rocks, and a gash across his forehead that had begun to clot. It was clear he had been attacked or had fallen. Either way, he could not survive alone in the harsh desert. Isabel took a deep breath, summoning the courage she had relied on for years. She knew that leaving him there meant certain death, and although she had learned to avoid unnecessary risks, her sense of humanity would not allow her to turn away. Slowly she knelt beside him, feeling the heat of the sun baking their surroundings, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are not alone," she said softly, her voice steady. "I will help you." Moving the man was difficult. He was heavy, and his body was weak and unresponsive at times. But Isabel was determined. Using her knowledge of the land, she guided him to a nearby cave she used for shelter. It was not much, just a small hollow in the rocky hillside, but it offered shade from the sun and some protection from the wind. She laid him down carefully on a bed of soft cloth and dried grass she kept for emergencies. She then went to fetch water from a hidden spring nearby, careful to keep an eye on him as she worked. As the hours passed, Isabel cleaned his wounds as best as she could. She used herbs she had gathered for their healing properties, applying them gently to the cuts and bruises. She wrapped torn cloth around his injuries, trying to stop the bleeding and reduce the risk of infection. The man groaned in pain but did not resist. He seemed too weak to do anything but breathe and try to keep his eyes open. Isabel offered him sips of water, encouraging him to drink despite the weakness that made even swallowing difficult. During these quiet moments, Isabel observed him closely. She could see that he was a rancher, judging by the style of his clothes and the smell of horses and livestock clinging to him. She had heard stories from travelers and villagers about men like him, people who worked tirelessly to manage cattle and land, often living isolated lives away from family and comfort. Yet here he was, vulnerable and dependent on a stranger. Isabel felt a strange connection to him, as though their lives, both shaped by loss and solitude, had crossed paths for a reason. Martin, as she later learned his name, tried to speak between groans of pain. I don't know if I'll make it," he said, his voice barely audible. Isabel shook her head gently, placing a hand over his chest. "You will," she said firmly. "You are stronger than you think. You are not alone now." She did not say it lightly. Her words carried the weight of experience, of someone who had faced despair and survived. She stayed with him through the night, keeping a small fire burning just outside the cave's entrance, enough to provide warmth without drawing attention. Throughout the night, Isabel thought about the fragility of life. She reflected on the moments in her past when she had lost loved ones, and how it had shaped her into the resilient woman she had become. And yet, she realized that even with all her strength, it was the act of helping someone else that made her feel truly alive. She whispered stories to Martin, tales of her ancestors and the land, hoping to keep his mind occupied and his spirit fighting. By morning, Martin's breathing had stabilized slightly, and he opened his eyes more fully. He looked at Isabel with a mixture of gratitude and awe. He tried to speak but coughed instead, the effort leaving him exhausted. Isabel handed him water and smiled gently. "Take your time," she said. "We will get through this together." At that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a bond formed not by words but by survival, empathy, and the simple human need to not face death alone. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh and unforgiving, yet within the small cave there was a fragile sense of hope. Isabel knew that the days ahead would not be easy. Healing Martin would require patience, skill, and constant vigilance. But she also knew that this encounter was more than just a chance meeting. It was an opportunity to connect, to share strength, and to remind both of them that even in the most desolate places, compassion could flourish. And so, with the rising sun casting its golden light across the desert, Isabel settled in beside Martin, ready to face the long, uncertain days ahead. She had helped many in her life, animals, plants, herself, but helping a human being in such dire need was unlike anything she had done before. The quiet determination in her eyes reflected her unspoken promise. He would not face death alone. For the first time in what felt like forever, Martin felt a spark of hope in the desert, and Isabel felt the quiet reassurance that her life, too, had purpose beyond survival. This was the beginning of a journey neither of them could have predicted, a journey that would test their limits, heal old wounds, and ultimately teach them the profound truth that no one, not even in the harshest desert, had to face life or death alone. Days passed in the desert, and Isabel remained by Martin's side. Every morning she would wake before the sun, moving quietly so as not to startle him. She brought water from the hidden spring and small amounts of food she had gathered, roots, fruits, and small animals she had trapped. Isabel had learned to survive with very little, but feeding someone who had been injured and weak was an entirely different task. She carefully mashed the food, making it easy for him to eat. Martin would look at her with tired eyes, and although he could barely speak, there was a silent acknowledgement in his gaze that he was grateful. As Martin regained some strength, he began to talk more, though his words came slowly. He told Isabel about his life as a cattle rancher, about the long days spent tending to his animals, and the lonely nights in a small, empty house far from his family. He had once been a man full of pride, sure of his path, but the desert had a way of humbling anyone who entered it unprepared. Isabel listened without judgment, offering only gentle encouragement. She could see the pain in his eyes, the deep loneliness that came from years of isolation, and she understood it all too well. Her own life had been shaped by loss and solitude, and in a strange way, she felt a connection with this stranger who had appeared in her life so unexpectedly. Martin tried to help himself at first, insisting that he could move and gather his own water. Isabel would smile softly and shake her head. "No," she would say, "you need rest. Let me help you. Together, we will make sure you survive." Slowly, he began to trust her guidance. He realized that her way of living in the desert was not just survival, it was wisdom. She knew where the water would be freshest, which herbs could heal wounds, and how to stay safe from dangers that lurked in the open land. Day by day, Martin learned to rely on her knowledge, and with that reliance came a sense of humility he had never felt before. At night, when the desert grew cold and the wind howled around the cave, Isabel would sit close to Martin. She would tell stories, stories of her family, her people, and the lessons they had learned from the land. Sometimes Martin would close his eyes and listen quietly. Other times he would ask questions, eager to understand a way of life so different from his own. Isabel's voice was calm and steady, like the desert itself, and Martin felt a strange sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He began to feel that perhaps there was more to life than work, than pride, than survival alone. Isabel also observed Martin's reactions carefully. She noticed small things, a wince when he shifted in pain, a hesitation before reaching for water, the way his lips trembled when he tried to speak. These details told her much about his state of mind. She adapted her care accordingly, making sure he moved slowly, rested often, and ate enough to regain strength. She taught him simple exercises to stretch his muscles and improve circulation, helping him recover physically while also fostering a sense of agency. Martin began to realize that Isabel's care was not just about keeping him alive, it was about helping him reclaim his life. One afternoon, after weeks of slow recovery, Martin attempted to stand on his own. He used a sturdy stick Isabel had fashioned as a walking aid and carefully rose to his feet. The effort was exhausting, and he nearly fell, but Isabel was right beside him, steadying him with a firm hand. For the first time, he felt the sun on his face and the warmth of the desert without the weight of injury holding him down. I can do this," he whispered, almost to himself. Isabel smiled, her eyes reflecting pride and encouragement. "Yes," she said gently, "you can. And I will be here every step of the way." Over the next few days, Martin's strength improved steadily. He could walk longer distances, gather small amounts of food, and even help Isabel with minor tasks around the cave. Their relationship grew deeper, not through words alone but through shared effort and trust. Martin began to understand that the desert, harsh as it was, had taught him patience, resilience, and the importance of connection. Isabel had taught him that survival was not just about physical strength, it was about compassion, trust, and recognizing the humanity in others. Martin also began to share stories from his past, revealing vulnerabilities he had kept hidden for years. He spoke of mistakes he had made, people he had hurt unintentionally, and opportunities he had missed because he had been too proud or too focused on work. Isabel listened without judgment, offering small insights when appropriate. "The past is part of who we are," she said one evening, "but it does not define what you can become. You have the power to change now, to choose differently." Her words resonated deeply with him. For the first time, Martin realized that survival alone was not enough. He wanted to live fully, with purpose and connection. As they spent more time together, Martin also observed Isabel closely. He saw her resilience, her quiet strength, and the deep wisdom she carried from her ancestors. She moved with grace and purpose, even in the harshest conditions, and she treated every living thing with respect. He began to admire her not just for her skill but for her character. He understood that her life had not been easy, yet she carried herself with dignity and compassion. In turn, Isabel began to see Martin not just as a man who had been injured, but as someone capable of growth, learning, and gratitude. Their bond was forming slowly, built on trust, care, and shared survival. One morning, after a particularly cold night, Martin turned to Isabel with a question he had been hesitant to ask. "Why are you helping me?" he said quietly. His voice carried a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Isabel looked at him, considering her answer carefully. "Because no one should face death alone," she replied simply. "And because we are stronger when we help each other. Life is harsh, but it is also precious. I know what it is to lose everything, and I do not want you to feel that alone." Her words touched Martin deeply. He realized that compassion was not weakness, it was strength. And in that moment, he began to see the desert not just as a place of hardship, but as a place of connection and hope. Days turned into weeks, and Martin grew stronger. He could now walk confidently, prepare simple meals, and assist Isabel with daily tasks. Their bond deepened, and they began to speak of dreams, hopes, and the possibilities that life still offered. Martin spoke of returning to his ranch, of rebuilding his life, and even of forming relationships he had once avoided. Isabel shared her own hopes, her quiet desire to see others live well, and her belief that every person could find purpose even in the harshest circumstances. Through these weeks, both of them changed. Martin became more patient, humble, and compassionate. He had faced his vulnerability and learned that it was not something to hide but to embrace. Isabel, in turn, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Caring for Martin reminded her that connection and empathy were as important as survival skills. She realized that even in a world full of loss, there could be moments of healing, understanding, and hope. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, Martin and Isabel sat outside the cave, watching the colors of the desert sky shift from gold to deep purple. Martin turned to her and said quietly, "I have never felt so cared for, so seen." Isabel smiled gently. "And you will not be alone anymore," she replied. "We face the world together and we learn from it together. That is what makes us strong." In the silence that followed, both of them understood that their lives had been changed forever. Their connection was not just about survival, it was about healing, growth, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing someone truly cares. By the end of this second part of their journey, Martin had recovered enough to begin moving with confidence in the desert. He still had a long way to go, but he no longer feared death or solitude. He had discovered the value of trust, compassion, and human connection. Isabel had taught him not only to survive but to live, and in the process, both of them had discovered that even the harshest landscapes could nurture the strongest bonds. Their days continued in a rhythm of care, conversation, and quiet reflection. The desert, once a place of isolation, had become a place of learning and connection. And in the quiet moments, when the wind whispered across the rocks and the sun warmed their backs, both Isabel and Martin understood that life, no matter how harsh, could be filled with hope, purpose, and the knowledge that they were no longer alone. The days in the desert had grown hotter, the sun burning with relentless intensity. Isabel and Martin had settled into a rhythm of survival, care, and cautious optimism. Martin's strength had returned gradually, and he was able to move with confidence, gather small amounts of food, and even assist Isabel with daily tasks. Yet life in the desert was never predictable, and the harshness of the land often reminded them of its power. One afternoon, while Martin was helping Isabel carry water from the hidden spring, he suddenly stopped and doubled over, a groan escaping his lips. Isabel rushed to his side, alarmed by the sudden change. His face was pale, sweat glistening on his forehead, and his breathing was uneven and shallow. Isabel's heart raced. "Martin, stay with me," she urged, gently lowering him to the ground. She examined him carefully, her trained eyes noticing the fever burning through his body, the rapid pulse, and the weakness that had returned to his limbs. This was more serious than she had anticipated. Martin tried to speak, but his voice was weak and broken. I thought I was better," he murmured, fear flickering in his eyes. Isabel shook her head softly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Sometimes the body hides its struggles until it can no longer fight," she said. "But do not worry, I will not leave you. You are not alone." She carried him back to the cave with as much care as she could, adjusting her pace to the uneven ground and making sure he remained as comfortable as possible. Once inside the small shelter, Isabel tended to him with even more precision. She prepared herbal poultices from leaves she had dried for such emergencies, soaking them in warm water before applying them to his fevered body. She encouraged him to drink small amounts of water slowly, knowing that sudden intake could overwhelm his weakened system. She fanned him gently to lower his temperature, whispering soothing words, telling stories of survival and strength from her past. Her presence was calm and steady, a constant anchor for him in the storm of illness. For hours Martin drifted in and out of consciousness, his body racked with chills and fever. Isabel stayed awake through the night, refusing to sleep, her eyes never leaving him. She would gently wipe the sweat from his forehead, adjust his blanket and whisper encouragements, reminding him to fight, to breathe, and to hold on. Each time he stirred, she held his hand, ensuring that he knew he was not facing this struggle alone. As the nights passed, Martin's condition fluctuated. One moment he would appear to improve, sitting up slightly and attempting to eat. The next he would collapse back fevered and weak, unable to speak coherently. Isabel realized that his body had been weakened not just by the injuries, but by the lack of proper care before she had found him. His immune system had been compromised, and the desert's unforgiving climate made recovery even harder. Yet she remained patient and persistent, knowing that time and careful care were the only paths to healing. During this critical period, Martin began to reflect deeply on his life. Lying in the cave, feverish and vulnerable, he thought about all the choices he had made, the moments he had ignored his own health, and the years spent in isolation on his ranch. He realized that he had taken life for granted, assuming that his strength and independence were enough to carry him through anything. Now, faced with his own fragility, he understood the value of connection, care, and trust. Isabel's presence had become his lifeline, and he knew that without her, he would not have survived the desert's challenges. Isabel noticed the subtle shifts in Martin's thoughts and emotions. Even in his delirium, she sensed a growing awareness of life's fragility and the importance of compassion. She spoke softly to him, sharing stories of resilience, hope, and courage. "You have survived because you have the will to fight," she said one night, her voice gentle but firm. "And because you are not alone. Even when life seems harsh, the connections we form give us strength. You must hold on." Her words seemed to reach him, calming his fears and grounding him, even as his body struggled to recover. One particularly difficult night, Martin's fever spiked dangerously. He became delirious, calling out for imagined figures from his past, his voice a mixture of fear and confusion. Isabel stayed by his side, holding his hand, whispering assurances and speaking softly about the land, the desert, and the animals they had seen together. "You are safe," she told him. "I am here. You will not face this alone." She carefully adjusted his position, making sure he was comfortable, and continued to monitor his breathing and temperature. Every small improvement, no matter how slight, became a victory in her eyes. During these nights, Isabel also faced her own fears. Memories of loss, isolation, and hardship surfaced, reminding her of her own vulnerabilities. Yet she did not allow them to overwhelm her. Instead, she channeled her fear into determination, using every skill she had learned over the years to protect Martin. She hunted small animals for food, collected water, and prepared medicinal herbs. She kept the fire burning at night, not just for warmth but as a symbol of life, a beacon in the darkness of uncertainty. Martin, despite his delirium, began to sense the unwavering care around him. He realized that Isabel's presence was more than physical aid, it was emotional strength. Her calm voice, her careful actions, and her patience reminded him that even in the most desperate moments, human connection could provide solace. He began to fight harder, willing himself to stay awake, drink water, and respond when she spoke. The bond between them deepened, forged not just through survival but through shared vulnerability. By the fourth day of his severe illness, Martin's condition began to stabilize slightly. Isabel's constant care had prevented infections and further complications, and his body started to respond to the herbs, rest, and hydration she provided. He was still weak, but the fever that had threatened to consume him was slowly diminishing. Martin opened his eyes more often, meeting Isabel's gaze with gratitude and a newfound respect for the woman who had saved his life. I don't know how to thank you," he whispered one morning. Isabel smiled softly. "You do not need to," she replied. "Stay alive, that is all the thanks I need." Even as his body healed, the emotional impact of the experience remained. Martin began to reflect on the isolation he had endured for so many years, the pride that had kept him from asking for help, and the mistakes he had made by undervaluing human connection. Isabel had shown him that strength was not only in self-reliance, but also in accepting care, trust, and the kindness of others. This realization filled him with a sense of humility and determination to live differently, to appreciate life in ways he had never considered. The desert, harsh and unrelenting, had tested both of them. Martin had faced the fragility of life and the consequences of his past choices, while Isabel had confronted the depths of her empathy and the challenges of caregiving under extreme conditions. Through it all, they had developed a bond that transcended words, a deep, mutual understanding rooted in trust, care, and shared survival. The nights that had seemed endless, filled with fear and uncertainty, had also become the moments in which their lives intersected most profoundly. By the end of this intense period, Martin had regained enough strength to sit up for long periods, eat with more ease, and even walk short distances outside the cave. Yet both of them knew that the journey was not over. The desert still demanded vigilance, and Martin still needed guidance, patience, and care to fully recover. Isabel remained by his side, her determination unwavering. "You are stronger than you realize," she said one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "And we will continue together." Martin nodded, feeling a sense of hope he had not known in years. The terror of near-death had changed him, teaching him lessons he could never have learned in comfort or isolation. Isabel had not only saved his life, but had shown him the power of compassion, patience, and human connection. Their journey, though far from over, had reached a turning point. Survival was no longer the only goal. Now, they were learning to live fully, to appreciate each other's presence, and to face the future with renewed strength. In the quiet of the cave that night, as the stars began to appear in the dark desert sky, Martin whispered a promise to himself. He would honor Isabel's care by living a life worthy of her efforts, by embracing the lessons of trust and connection, and by never taking life for companionship for granted again. Isabel, sitting nearby, felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her work had not been in vain. Together, they had faced the harshest trial of their journey and had emerged stronger, bonded, and wiser. The desert slowly began to feel less like a place of danger and more like a teacher, guiding Martin and Isabel toward understanding, growth, and resilience. Martin's body had healed enough that he could walk without assistance, collect water, and even help Isabel with her daily chores. Yet the lessons of the past weeks went far beyond physical recovery. Both of them had changed in ways that could not be measured by strength alone. They had come to rely on one another, not just for survival, but for the emotional support that had become the foundation of their bond. Each morning, Isabel taught Martin about the land around them. She showed him how to recognize edible plants, how to find water in hidden springs, and how to predict the weather by observing the sky and the wind. She demonstrated how to move quietly, respecting the desert's delicate balance, and how to observe signs of danger without fear. At first, Martin struggled to absorb all of her knowledge. He had spent his life managing cattle and fields in a very different environment, where rules and expectations were rigid and predictable. The desert, in contrast, demanded flexibility, patience, and humility. Slowly, day by day, he learned to adapt, and each new skill he mastered became a source of pride. Isabel also taught him about the ways of her people, the Apache ways that had been passed down for generations. She spoke of respect for the earth, for animals, and for one another. She explained that survival was not just about enduring the physical hardships of life, but about living with honor, compassion, and awareness. Martin listened intently, realizing that he had never truly understood the deeper rhythms of nature or the importance of living in harmony with it. This knowledge, paired with Isabel's guidance, began to change the way he thought about his own life. In turn, Martin shared stories of his own experiences. He spoke of his ranch, of the long days spent caring for his animals, and of the lessons he had learned in solitude. Isabel listened carefully, drawing parallels between their lives despite the obvious differences. She saw in him a man who had worked hard, who had faced challenges, and who had also known isolation and loss. Their conversations became a bridge, connecting two worlds, hers of tradition and survival, his of labor and independence. Through these exchanges, they learned from each other, gaining insight into lives that had seemed so different yet shared the same struggles. As Martin regained strength, he began to explore the area more confidently. He would walk further from the cave, learning to observe the desert without fear, noticing signs of animals, changes in vegetation, and the subtle movements of the wind. Isabel accompanied him, offering guidance when needed but allowing him the freedom to practice on his own. With each successful excursion, Martin's confidence grew, and he began to understand that the desert, which had once seemed harsh and unforgiving, was full of wisdom for those willing to observe and learn. One afternoon, after a successful day of exploring, Martin and Isabel rested by a small cluster of rocks. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Martin looked at Isabel and said quietly, "I never knew life could feel so alive. I thought surviving was all I needed, but this is something more." Isabel smiled, her eyes reflecting warmth and understanding. "Life is not only about survival," she said. "It is about learning, growing, and sharing with those around us. Strength is important, but so is compassion." Her words resonated deeply with him, reinforcing the lessons he had been learning through both struggle and care. Over the following weeks, Martin's progress continued. He became more self-sufficient, yet he also learned the importance of seeking guidance when necessary. Isabel encouraged him to ask questions, to make mistakes, and to learn from them without fear of judgment. Their bond grew stronger, built on mutual respect and trust. Martin realized that Isabel had not only saved his life, but had also opened his eyes to a way of living that he had never considered. He had learned patience, resilience, and the profound value of human connection. As their days together lengthened, Isabel began to notice changes within herself as well. Caring for Martin had reminded her that even a person who had endured great loss could still find meaning and purpose in helping another. She had always lived independently, relying on her own skills and instincts to survive. Yet the act of nurturing someone else brought a new sense of fulfillment. She found joy in watching Martin regain his strength, hearing him ask questions, and seeing the spark of curiosity and understanding in his eyes. This connection reminded her that life, even in its harshest form, could hold beauty and purpose when shared. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Martin and Isabel sat outside the cave, reflecting on their journey. Martin spoke of his regrets, the moments he had taken life for granted, the relationships he had neglected, and the pride that had kept him from asking for help when he needed it. Isabel listened, her expression calm and compassionate. "We cannot change the past," she said. "But we can choose how we live now. Every day is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to act with intention." Her words gave him comfort, a reminder that the future could be different if he was willing to embrace change. As the days turned into weeks, Martin and Isabel began to work together in more practical ways. They repaired the cave, reinforced its walls against the wind, and created storage areas for food and water. Martin learned to hunt small animals with patience, using techniques Isabel had taught him, and he began to understand the delicate balance of the desert ecosystem. He realized that the land required respect and observation, not domination. Isabel watched with quiet pride as he adapted, recognizing that his growth was not just physical but spiritual and emotional. Their evenings were filled with conversation, laughter, and storytelling. Martin began to appreciate Isabel's wisdom and resilience, and she, in turn, valued his willingness to learn and his growing humility. Together, they reflected on the challenges they had faced and the lessons they had learned. Martin realized that he had gained far more than physical survival. He had gained perspective, understanding, and the ability to see life through a lens of compassion. Isabel had discovered that even after profound loss, the act of helping another could bring renewal and purpose. One afternoon, while observing the desert from a rocky outcrop, Martin turned to Isabel and said, "I feel different. Stronger, yes, but also more aware. I see the world in a way I never did before, and it is because of you." Isabel placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled. "It is not just me," she said. "It is the desert, your effort, and your willingness to learn. Change comes from within, but guidance and care can light the way." In that moment, they both understood that their journey was a shared one, a partnership built on mutual respect, growth, and understanding. Martin also began to think about the life that awaited him beyond the desert. He realized that returning to his ranch would no longer be the same. He wanted to live with more awareness, to value relationships, and to approach life with patience and humility. Isabel encouraged these reflections, sharing insights about the importance of intention, presence, and balance. Their conversations became lessons in life, not just survival, and Martin felt a sense of purpose he had never known. As their time in the desert continued, both Martin and Isabel noticed the subtle shifts in themselves and in one another. The fear, uncertainty, and pain that had once dominated their days were now replaced with confidence, hope, and resilience. Martin had regained his physical strength and learned valuable skills, but the most significant changes were internal. He had developed patience, humility, and a deeper appreciation for life. Isabel, too, had grown, finding fulfillment in guiding and nurturing someone through a period of intense challenge. Together, they began to see the desert not as a place of hardship, but as a teacher, a landscape that demanded respect, attention, and compassion. The lessons they had learned extended beyond survival. They had learned how to trust, how to support, and how to grow through connection. Their bond had deepened into something profound, rooted in shared experiences, empathy, and the understanding that life's greatest strength comes from care and compassion. By the end of this part of their journey, both Martin and Isabel were transformed. The desert, once a symbol of hardship and isolation, had become a place of learning, growth, and connection. Martin had regained his strength, acquired knowledge, and discovered the value of compassion and trust. Isabel had experienced the profound fulfillment that comes from nurturing another, realizing that even after loss, life could hold purpose and meaning. Together, they had learned lessons that would stay with them forever. Survival was important, but growth, empathy, and connection were what made life truly meaningful. The desert had changed for Martin and Isabel. It was no longer only a harsh and unforgiving place. It had become a classroom, a sanctuary, and a reminder of the power of resilience, trust, and human connection. Martin's body was strong again, his injuries healed and his mind clear. But more than that, he carried with him the lessons of patience, humility, and compassion that Isabel had taught him. Every day he felt a growing awareness that life was not only about surviving, but about living with purpose and meaning. As he stood outside the cave one morning, feeling the warm wind on his face, Martin thought about the journey he had endured. The memory of being attacked, left weak and helpless, still haunted him, but it no longer filled him with despair. Instead, it reminded him of the kindness and care he had received, the tireless dedication of Isabel, and the strength that could come from human connection. He realized that life could be fragile and fleeting, but it was also full of opportunities for growth, gratitude, and love. Isabel noticed the changes in Martin as well. The man who had once been proud, isolated, and wary of others had transformed into someone who was humble, thoughtful, and aware of the importance of relationships. He approached the world with caution but also with openness, a willingness to learn and to give back. She felt a quiet pride, not just in his physical recovery, but in the growth of his character. She understood that her role in his life had been more than care. It had been guidance, mentorship, and the gentle illumination of paths he had never considered. In the following days, Martin and Isabel began to prepare for his eventual departure from the desert. He knew he would return to his ranch, to the life he had left behind, but he also knew that he could never forget the lessons he had learned and the bond he had formed with Isabel. Together, they worked to gather the necessary supplies for the journey, creating bundles of food, water, and essential tools. Martin practiced navigating the desert paths with confidence, while Isabel offered advice and guidance, ensuring that he could travel safely and independently. One afternoon, as they rested under the shade of a rocky outcrop, Martin spoke of his future. "I want to live differently," he said quietly. "I want to be more aware of life, of the people around me, and of the importance of connection. I have wasted too much time in pride and isolation. Now I understand that strength is not only physical but also emotional and spiritual." Isabel smiled, her eyes reflecting both warmth and pride. "You have learned well," she said, "but remember, the journey of life is ongoing. Keep these lessons with you and continue to grow every day. Connection, compassion, and awareness will guide you well." Martin reflected deeply on these words. He realized that returning to his ranch would be different from what he had known. He had previously lived in a routine, managing his land and animals, often feeling lonely and detached from others. Now, he envisioned a life of awareness, gratitude, and engagement. He wanted to strengthen relationships with neighbors, share the wisdom he had gained in the desert, and ensure that no one he cared about would face life's challenges alone. Isabel's guidance had opened his eyes to a broader understanding of what it meant to truly live. As the day turned to evening, they sat together watching the sun dip below the distant hills, painting the desert sky in deep shades of red, orange, and purple. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding and mutual respect. Martin turned to Isabel and said softly, "You saved my life, but more importantly, you changed it. I will never forget your care, your patience, and your wisdom." Isabel placed a hand gently on his shoulder. and you have shown me the power of trust, of resilience, and of human connection. Together, we have learned that life, even in its harshest form, can offer hope, growth, and meaning. The following days were spent in preparation for departure. Martin learned to rely on his new skills and knowledge while continuing to practice safety and mindfulness in the desert. Isabel guided him in tracking the sun, observing the stars, and reading the subtle signs of the land. Each lesson reinforced the importance of awareness, patience, and respect. Martin understood that survival was not just a physical task, but a mental and emotional practice. Isabel's teachings had equipped him with the tools to face any challenges he might encounter in the future. On the morning of his departure, Martin packed the last of his supplies, feeling both excitement and a touch of sadness. The desert had become more than a place of survival. It had been a place of transformation, healing, and profound connection. Isabel stood nearby, offering guidance and support, but allowing him the independence he now possessed. He turned to her, gratitude shining in his eyes. "I will carry everything you have taught me," he said. "I will honor your care by living with awareness, compassion, and purpose." Isabel smiled, a quiet strength in her gaze. "That is all I could hope for. Go forward with courage and wisdom, and remember that life is about more than surviving. It is about living fully." Martin began the journey back to his ranch with a sense of purpose and clarity he had never known before. Each step was measured, deliberate, and mindful. He observed the desert with respect, noticing its beauty, its subtle dangers, and the lessons it offered. He reflected on the time he had spent with Isabel, realizing that the bond they had formed would remain with him forever. The care, guidance, and wisdom she had shared were gifts that could never be taken away, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the experience. Isabel watched him leave, her heart filled with quiet satisfaction. She knew that her work had been meaningful, not only in saving Martin's life, but in guiding him toward personal growth, awareness, and connection. She understood that the desert had tested both of them, shaping them into stronger, wiser, and more compassionate individuals. Their journey together had been a lesson in resilience, trust, and the transformative power of care. As Martin traveled further, he began to encounter others in the desert and along the paths to his ranch. He shared some of the lessons he had learned with those he met, offering guidance and support where needed. People began to notice a change in him, the humility, awareness, and kindness that now characterized his actions. He understood that life was not only about his own survival, but about contributing positively to the world around him. Isabel's teachings had extended beyond their time together, influencing not only his life but potentially the lives of many others. By the time he reached his ranch, Martin felt a sense of renewal and purpose. He walked through the familiar lands with a new perspective, appreciating the details he had previously overlooked: the gentle sway of the grass, the patterns of the clouds, and the lives of the animals he cared for. He approached his work with patience and mindfulness, valuing each moment and interaction. His relationships with neighbors and workers changed as well, marked by increased empathy, awareness, and a willingness to listen and support. The transformation that had begun in the desert continued to unfold in every aspect of his life. Though he returned to his routines, Martin never forgot Isabel and the desert that had taught him so much. He often reflected on the quiet lessons of patience, resilience, and compassion, integrating them into his daily life. He recognized that the most important aspect of survival was not merely physical strength, but the ability to connect with others, to care, and to grow through shared experiences. His gratitude for Isabel's guidance became a guiding principle, shaping his choices and actions. In the years that followed, Martin shared the story of his journey with those around him. He spoke not only of survival in the desert, but of the lessons he had learned about human connection, empathy, and the importance of caring for one another. People who heard his story were inspired by his transformation and the wisdom he had gained. The experience became more than a personal journey. It became a testament to the power of guidance, trust, and compassion. Isabel continued her life in the desert, tending to the land and living in harmony with its rhythms. She carried with her the knowledge that her care had made a lasting impact on Martin's life. Though they were physically apart, the bond they had formed remained strong in spirit. She found fulfillment in knowing that her actions had contributed to another person's growth, well-being, and understanding of life. The desert, which had tested them both, had ultimately become a place of healing, learning, and transformation. Years later, Martin often returned to the desert, visiting the cave where he had been saved. Each visit reminded him of the lessons he had learned and the bond he had shared with Isabel. He would sit quietly, reflecting on the journey that had transformed him, honoring the care, guidance, and wisdom that had shaped his life. And every time he remembered her words, "You are not alone," he felt a renewed sense of strength, gratitude, and purpose. Their story became a quiet legend in the villages nearby, a tale of survival, compassion, and human connection. People spoke of the desert, of the man who had been saved from near death, and of the woman who had cared for him with unwavering patience and wisdom. But beyond the legend, the real lesson remained. Life's greatest strength comes not only from endurance but from empathy, trust, and the bonds we form with others. In the harshest of places, hope, growth, and connection could flourish, proving that no one truly needed to face life or death alone. And so, Martin lived his life with awareness, compassion, and gratitude, honoring the lessons of the desert and the care of Isabel. Isabel, in turn, continued her life of quiet strength, carrying the knowledge that even in a world of loss and hardship, one act of kindness could change a life forever. Their journey, though separated by distance, remained forever connected by the shared experiences, the wisdom gained, and the promise whispered in a moment of despair. You will not die alone.